Hello, I'm R.A. Spratt. I write and perform this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, I'm a children's author, so you can buy a book by me, or you can buy me a coffee by going to buymeacoffee.com/storiesRASpratt. It's an easy way to make a small thank you gift to the show so I can keep kicking this can down the road. The podcast directory you're using right now should have a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the show notes, or you can type it into your browser. That's buymeacoffee.com/storiesRASpratt. All contributions are gratefully appreciated. Hello and welcome to Bedtime Stories with me, R.A. Spratt. Well, it's quite late at night here when I'm recording this. It's like 10 o'clock at night on Tuesday night, and this episode has to drop at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. So I've got to record this and edit it, which I will be able to do, but I don't think I'm going to be going to bed much before 1 a.m. The reason this is all quite last minute, I did actually write this story on Monday, but today I knew I wasn't going to be able to record this before now because I had to go up to Sydney because they were launching the Australian Children's Laureate, who's Andy Griffith, who you may know. He wrote the 13-story Treehouse books as well as many, many others. Anyway, so they had a big launch announcing that he is the new Australian Children's Laureate. So I went up to Sydney today, which was a lot of fun because I got to see all my author friends and eat finger sandwiches, and I met an Auslan interpreter, sign language interpreter, and I was picking his brain about how to do some sign language. So yeah, I had a lot of fun up in Sydney today. And then my daughter, the one that Vanessa is based on, if you've listened to the early stories, the Tall Tale stories. Anyway, she started university, so I had to go up to visit her at college because I was dropping off some of her things. So that is why I'm here at 10 o'clock at night, back in my office in Bowral. It's very muggy here. It's sort of the tail end of summer. The trees are starting to turn here in Bowral, but the weather hasn't really turned cool yet. But, we're getting there, so it's going to be nice again soon. So let's get into it. I have promised to do the story of Joan of Arc, and that is the one I have done. So that's the one I'm going to read to you now. Here we go. The True History of Joan of Arc, as told by Nanny Piggins. Nanny Piggins, Boris and the children were sitting in the garden toasting marshmallows over a charcoal kettle barbecue that they had borrowed from the retired army colonel who lived around the corner and was desperately in love with Nanny Piggins. The reason for the fire was not because they had intended to cook a barbecue. They needed a fire because it was report card day. Whenever the children's report cards came out, Nanny Piggins felt it was best to destroy the evidence before Mr. Green came home. The children actually did very well at school. They were all keen readers, with a good knowledge of history and geography. Their nanny's stories helped with that. And they were good at maths, thanks to the enormous amount of cake-related maths they did at home. Bacon actually requires a surprising amount of algebra. There was nothing wrong with the children's marks on their report card. It was the number on the back of the last page that was the problem. You see, the last item on the report card was the record of number of days absent. And it was a concern if this number became a 2-digit number. That would indicate a serious disease or perhaps a prolonged kidnapping. But for the number of days absent in a school year to reach a 3-digit number actually took an extraordinary amount of effort, and all 3 of the Green children had achieved this milestone. Luckily, report cards were very flammable. They quickly disappeared amongst the flames dancing out of the charcoal briquettes. Then, since they had a fire going, Nanny Piggins naturally brought out some marshmallows. Nanny Piggins always had an industrial-sized packet of marshmallows in the cupboard, just in case she saw some gymnastics on television and was inspired to learn a new tumbling routine. Safety is very important in gymnastics. When they learn new moves, gymnasts do so over pits full of foam rubber. Nanny Piggins didn't have any foam rubber, so instead she dug a pit in the garden and filled it with marshmallows. She felt it was actually safer because once you landed in the pit, you could eat your way out. It's not nice having to eat your way out of a foam rubber pit. So anyway, that is how Nanny Piggins and the children came to be roasting marshmallows on sticks that they had pulled out of their father's dahlia bed. "Ah, this is lovely," said Nanny Piggins with contentment. "It reminds me of my dear cousin Joan." What, because she liked marshmallows? Asked Samantha. No, because she burned at the stake, said Nanny Piggins. What? Exclaimed all three green children. She was burned like a steak? Asked Michael. Not a steak like a beefsteak, said Nanny Piggins. A steak like a big pole. That sounds worse, said Michael. Oh, it was, said Nanny Piggins. Back in the olden medieval days, when someone was naughty and the government got really cross about it, they would erect a big post in the middle of town, tie the naughty person to it, build a bonfire round their feet, then set fire to the whole thing. That's horrific, said Samantha. Who exactly was your cousin Joan? Asked Derek, beginning to suspect her identity. Well, you may have heard of her, said Nanny Piggins. Her name was Joan Piggins of Arc. The Joan of Arc? Asked Samantha. Yes, that's what her name was shortened to, agreed Nanny Piggins. Joan of Arc, the great hero of France? Asked Derek. Yes. Wasn't she a saint too? Asked Michael. Yes, Saint Joan, that's the one, said Nanny Piggins. And she was your cousin? Asked Derek. And a pig? Exclaimed Samantha. Well, she did lead the French army to defeat the English army in multiple battles and annoy the church so much with her fashion sense that they burned her at a stake for being a heretic, said Nanny Piggins. So, of course, she was a Piggins. You don't think a human could be that spectacular, do you? Well, when you put it that way, said Michael, it does make sense. You'd better tell us the whole story, said Derek. All right, I will, said Nanny Piggins. But just give me an hour to duck into the house and whip up some pain au chocolat. Telling French stories always makes me want to eat delicious pastries. And so, a short time later, they were settled again by the fire, eating pain au chocolat, drinking hot chocolate, and finishing off the marshmallows, as Nanny Piggins began her tale. It all started 600 years ago with my dear cousin Joan going about her daily French peasant business. Her parents had a small farm, but being French and Pigginses, all the women in her family were incredibly brilliant at making desserts. So Joan was in the kitchen making a lovely chocolate souffle for their family lunch when the Archangel Michael appeared before her. What's an archangel? Asked Michael. It's like a regular angel, but with a sword, said Nanny Piggins. Angels carry swords, said Samantha. That doesn't sound very angelic. Well, I've never seen an archangel myself, said Nanny Piggins, but in all the paintings I've ever seen, archangels always carry swords. I didn't make it up, so for now could you just let me get on with the story? As I was saying, the Archangel Michael appeared before Joan and said, Bonjour, Joan. I'm Michael. God has sent me to tell you he wants you to lead the French army to victory against the English. He what? Said Joan. He wants you to lead the French army in battle, repeated the Archangel Michael. Are you sure you've got the right person? Asked Joan. You do realise I'm a 14-year-old peasant girl. Obviously, I am staggeringly beautiful and fantastically athletic, because that's a burden all women in my family have to endure. But I'm not a soldier, or even an adult. Oh, he definitely picked you, said the Archangel. Well, that's very nice, said Joan, but I'm afraid it's a hard pass from me. The English are everywhere in France. They've taken over half the country. I don't want to tromp about the countryside, vanquishing them and throwing them out of one city at a time. I'm busy here. You're just making a chocolate cake, said the Archangel. How dare you, gasped Joan. It was a good job the Archangel was an angel and therefore floating in midair, or she would have stomped on his foot. This is not a mere cake. Although there's nothing mere about any cake. All cake is fabulous, so long as it doesn't have carrots in it. But this is a higher form. This is a chocolate souffle. Oh, I am sorry, said the Archangel, realising he'd made a terrible faux pas. Besides, the war's been going on for 90 years, said Joan. What's the rush to finish it now? Well, you see, the king needs to be crowned at Reims, because that's where French kings are always crowned, and he can't do that if Reims isn't a part of France, because the English control the city. The other kings will make fun of him if he gets crowned in his own backyard at home. They'll say that doesn't count. But why me? Asked Joan. Wouldn't it be more sensible getting a general to lead the army? Well, the problem with generals is they're all too sensible, said the Archangel. They can read and count and are educated in military tactics, so they can see that it's a hopeless cause that will end in disaster and thousands of lost lives. Whereas you are just an illiterate peasant girl. You'll be much easier to convince to do something totally delulu. Well, it's still a hard pass from me, said Joan. I'm just a peasant. It doesn't matter to me what nationality the king is. I've still got to get up and bake the croissants in the morning either way. Fine, said the Archangel, but just so you know, if France has an English king, then the whole country will have to stop eating French food and start eating English food. What? Said Joan. This got her attention. You will only be able to eat English food, said the Archangel. Well, that's not so bad, said Joan. The English have some good food, like Eccles cakes and clotted cream fudge. Yes, but they don't have croissants, pain au chocolat, chocolat mousse, tartelette chocolat, gâteau chocolat, soufflé chocolat. Good gracious! This cannot be endured, said Joan. We can't live without all those beautiful French desserts. Quick, give me your sword. I'll defeat those English barbarians. And so that's what she set out to do. But the problem was Joan didn't have an army herself, so she had to go to the royal court to see Charles VII and borrow his. Charles was very surprised to be confronted by a startlingly attractive 17-year-old pig asking to lead his army. But you have to understand, he was only 26 years old himself, and his generals weren't doing a very good job of running his army, and he didn't fancy leading the army himself. You see, if you lead, you have to be at the front, and there are too many pointy things being stabbed about there. So when Joan asked to lead his army, he said, "Sure, okay. I was sending an army with fresh supplies to help the soldiers at Orleans. You can go along with them." Now, travelling across the French countryside in year 90 of the 100 Years' War, when half the country was occupied by a foreign army, was not terribly safe for anyone, but particularly not for a teenage girl who was also a staggeringly glamorous pig. Men would have been constantly wanting to marry her or ask her for her autograph, which she wouldn't be able to do because she was illiterate and they couldn't read because they were illiterate too. Also, riding a horse is tricky to do in a skirt. So, for all these reasons, Joan decided to dress like a soldier. She put on men's clothes. Now, this is going to become important in the story later. So, Joan arrived at Orleans and the soldiers there were delighted to see her. Being at war for 90 years was exhausting, and when a staggeringly good-looking pig turns up with a fresh army and lots of French food, most likely cake, it really does lift the spirits. When they went into battle the next day, they took Joan along with them, and she had a marvellous time. She stood at the front of the army, waving a brightly coloured banner, and she had fun dictating rude messages, which someone wrote down for her, and then tying the notes to arrows and firing them over the battlements. "That sounds just like something you would do," said Michael, "when you think of something really cutting to say and want to go down to the library to yell it through the automatic doors at the head librarian." "Yes, it is a gift all we Pigginses are blessed with," said Nanny Piggins, "the ability to come up with some really cutting retorts." So, Joan had a lovely time. Yes, she did get shot in the neck with an arrow at one stage, but it was barely a scratch, and the French army soon overpowered the fortress, and the English retreated, which we all know is the history book's way of saying they ran away like scaredy cats. Now, since sending a teenage girl to lead the army had worked way better than any other military tactic the French royal family had tried in the previous 90 years, Charles VII let Joan go on to the next battle, and the next battle, and the next. And she kept winning. The more battles she went to, the more success she had. And she wasn't just holding a banner and writing rude messages anymore. She was giving the generals tips and coming up with strategies and climbing siege ladders, getting bonked on the head with rocks and even shot in the leg with a crossbow at one stage. She was having a marvellous time. And then Joan finally led the French to victory at Reims, and King Charles VII was able to travel there and be crowned, making him a real and proper king, just like his grandfathers and great-grandfathers. So King Charles was very happy. "Well done, Joan," said King Charles. "I'm a proper king now, so you can go back to your peasant holding and return to your peasant life." "But I'm a military genius," said Joan, "and half of France is still occupied by the English." "Well, I'm sure if we ignore the English, they'll go home eventually," said Charles. "But you got to let me fight on and drive them out of Paris," said Joan. "There are so many good cake shops in Paris. They need to be liberated." Charles couldn't say no. He couldn't be outbolded by a teenage girl, no matter how spectacularly good-looking she was. So, with a lot of grumbling, he let her keep on fighting. But Joan's run of luck had turned. She lost her next 2 battles, and then she was captured. "Oh no, poor Joan," said Samantha. "Naturally she escaped," said Nanny Piggins. "Hooray," said Boris. "But then she was captured again," said Nanny Piggins. "Oh dear," said Boris. "To stop her escaping, they locked her in a castle in a high tower with a deep moat," said Nanny Piggins. "Oh no," said Michael. "But then she escaped from the castle by jumping out of the window." "Because the moat was full of water?" asked Derek. "No, the moat was dry," said Nanny Piggins, "but there was a little mud at the bottom, and that's all a pig needs to make a safe landing. But she was winded by the fall, and so she was recaptured. Which is why, when you escape from a castle, it is so important to think laterally." "What do you mean?" asked Derek. "Well, think about it. Joan was imprisoned in a castle in the middle of a war," said Nanny Piggins. "There would have been cannons. If she'd just blasted herself out of one of those, she could have landed safely in a town miles away. If she'd aimed well, she could have even landed outside a nice little patisserie and had a snack. And then they never would have recaptured her. But Joan was just a teenager, so we shouldn't be too harsh." The English took Joan to their headquarters, where they put her on trial for heresy. "Why? Was it a crime in the medieval history times to have a bad hair day?" asked Boris. "No, heresy has nothing to do with hair," said Nanny Piggins. "Heresy was the crime of defying the rules of the church." "Oh, so were they cross because she said she'd been visited by an angel?" "Well, yes," said Nanny Piggins, "but also the clothes really ticked them off. They said that dressing like a man was heresy." "Really?" said Samantha, "just for wearing trousers?" "Well, the English have never been as fashion-forward as the French," said Nanny Piggins. "Also, they probably still had a lot of trauma for all their battles with Scottish men wearing kilts." Now, when you imagine this trial, you have to realise it was not like trials we have today. It wasn't a jury of 12 regular people. It was a jury of 108 clergymen. And they all had opinions, so Joan was interrogated for days. It was very wearisome. And they were all clergymen, so they were never going to be big fans of a teenage girl who said she didn't have to listen to them because she got her instructions directly from an archangel. So the jurors decided that Joan was guilty and took her out into the public square to officially denounce her. Joan was totally exhausted at this stage, so she just said, "Fine, whatever," and signed the document accepting their decision. But the problem is she didn't read the fine print, because you will remember she was illiterate, which meant she could not read. And in the fine print it said that if she relapsed and committed heresy again, then she would be punished with death. And that was that. As punishment, they shaved Joan's head, which was not a fashionable haircut at the time, gave her a dress to wear and chained her up in a cell, where the soldiers who guarded her were very mean. They also put a men's outfit in her cell to tempt her into relapsing, because they really did want to execute her. "What meanies," said Boris. And eventually Joan did put the men's clothes on, because a party frock looks nice, but it's not terribly practical when you're chained to a wall in a military prison. And she also started talking to the angels and saints who came to her in visions. St. Catherine and St. Margaret did like to pop by for a chat. She had nothing else to do in prison, so of course she was going to talk to them. And that was enough. According to the terms of the document she had signed, Joan had relapsed. A committee of 42 priests discussed the matter, held a vote, and unanimously agreed that Joan was totally guilty of relapsing into heresy. So she was handed over to the English, and they put up a stake in the middle of the old marketplace and built a big bonfire around it. "Oh no, this story is terrible," wailed Boris. "Now, Boris, you mustn't fret," said Nanny Piggins. "You must have faith in my dear cousin Joan. She was a Piggins after all." "But we know it ended badly," said Samantha, starting to get a little weepy herself. "It's in the history books. Joan of Arc was executed." "Really?" said Nanny Piggins. "That just goes to show how silly historians really are." "You're saying that's not what happened?" asked Michael. "Well, they did tie Joan to a stake and get out a box of matches," said Nanny Piggins. "But just as they were about to strike the match, Joan's mum rode into the square on a horse. 'Hey, look over there,' Joan's mum called out. 'That looks like a big pile of clotted cream fudge.' The English turned to see what she was pointing at, and Mrs. Ark quickly whipped out a life-size marshmallow replica of her daughter, untied Joan and swapped them, then hid Joan inside a large sack. "Hey, I don't see any fudge," complained an English general, turning back. "Oh, sorry, my mistake," said Joan's mum. "My eyesight isn't what it used to be. It must just have been a big pile of horse droppings. All brown lumps look the same to me. Carry on with your execution." And so the fire was lit, and the English thought they had executed Joan of Arc, their great military nemesis. But all they'd really burned was a 60-kilogram life-size marshmallow, which really was a crime against the culinary arts, and therefore its own form of heresy. "But what happened to Joan?" asked Samantha. "Oh, she was fine," said Nanny Piggins. "No one recognised her when she wasn't wearing trousers, so she went back to her village and lived happily ever after, baking pain au chocolat and chatting to all the heavenly angels and saints who came to visit. But from then on she had the good sense not to tell anyone about it, and certainly not to lead any more French armies. Which is perhaps why the French have struggled in so many subsequent military actions." The end. Time for bed. All right. Well, that's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed researching that one. It was fascinating because a lot of the stories I researched, there's different versions and they were told orally, just people telling the story to each other, and then they weren't written down for ages. And when they were written down, there were different versions. But the story of Joan of Arc is interesting because there were 2 or 3 court cases, and everything that everyone said was written down. So you can read exactly what Joan of Arc herself said. So it's interesting. You can read exactly what this 17-year-old peasant girl from the 1400s in France was saying in a court case. So there's heaps of information about it. So if you ever have to do a school project about someone from history, I highly recommend her. She was very interesting. So I hope you enjoyed my version. That's it for now. I'm not sure what I'm doing next week, but until then, goodbye. Hello, it's me again. If you enjoyed listening to Bedtime Stories with R.A. Spratt, it would be really helpful if you could like, subscribe, follow, and or review the show on whatever podcast platform you're listening to now. Every little one of those digital affirmations helps, and the bigger this podcast gets, the more I can justify procrastinating from my real job to keep bringing these stories to you. Thank you.